This happened back when I was a teenager, probably about 15 years ago now. I lived in a smaller town where, if something happened to you, the whole town seemed to know before the end of the week. This also meant that people knew who not to mess with or talk about, if you catch my drift. I was just lucky enough to work for one of those people, and lucky that he treated me like his own daughter. I worked at a local pawn shop, and just in case, I'm going to make up some names too. It was run by a guy named Tony. Tony was a big guy, physically and in popularity and personality. Everyone knew him, and was either close to him, steered clear of him, or was on his bad side. My dad used to work for him, and I thought that he was a good guy, so he suggested that I apply at the pawn shop, thinking he would be able to help me get the job. Of course, it worked, and shortly after, his wife was showing me around and telling me how to use the register. I was mainly working after school, helping ring people up and cleaning up shelves. After I graduated, I continued to work there for a few years since I was making decent money and trying to go to a local community college. That's when I really started tackling the night shifts, and I got to see a bit more of why Tony was so popular. You see, the pawn shop was a legit business up front, and people were always bringing stuff to trade or have appraised. The size of the building was big enough to have quite the collection of stuff too, from housewares, toys, electronics, weapons, and a lot more. So, there were plenty of purchases being made all day long. But, at night, Tony had a whole other business being conducted in the back. He ran poker tournaments, and I'm assuming that's definitely helped fluff the numbers for the shop as well, as being why some of the people avoided him. As I got older and after I left the pawn shop, I learned that it definitely wasn't small bets going on back there. So, while he had his game going on in the back, he had someone running the front, leaving the store open often late into the night. This was used as a cover for why they were still open, I suppose. Once I turned 18, I started working that same late-night shift. Surprisingly, we still had some people coming in at night to look around the place. Or maybe Tony's friends picking up some consolation prizes. We also had people coming in at all hours, with all kinds of odd items, looking to make some fast money. After watching others and being taught some of the simpler methods of inspecting items, I was able to offer prices as well. I also learned how to put my foot down and not get walked all over when it's not what they were expecting. I also had Tony and Margaret on my side in most cases. So, when I had a guy come in with some old comic books, I expected the whole thing to be pretty routine. It was super late when this guy came in. I remember this because I figured it was just another one of those guys that was expecting me to not look too closely, thinking I would be too tired or uncaring. I've had people come in with things as stupid as a rock and trying to claim it was part of the boulder that sealed Jesus in his tomb before he came back. The problem with this assumption was, 1, I don't half-ass things when my boss is Tony, and 2, I'm actually an avid comic book collector, thanks to my dad. So, this guy comes in with one of those bank boxes that was heavily damaged. The bottom of it looked soft and warped like it was wet and recently dried out, and there was no lid. And this already had me thinking that the comics were probably in bad condition. He did have them all in sleeves though, so I guess he had that going for him. He said that they were all original prints, and that we should be grateful that he chose us to sell them to. I started pulling out a few of them to inspect them, but I could instantly tell that they were not as rare and special as he implied. To not bore anyone with the details, I'll just say that the most damning part was where the copyright and pricing was obviously altered, as it was slightly skewed, and you could see a fine dark line, like something was printed or stamped there. It wasn't raised like it was taped over, but I've seen that too. Hoping to not cause a scene, I offered the guy like $25 for the box. There were probably about 100 or so comics in there, and I was expecting to throw them in the $1 or less comic bin that we had, so we could make some kind of profit off of them. The guy reacted like I had just kicked his dog, saying that he had rare comics in there. I told him that there may be some rare ones, sure, but due to the damage that most of them had, they're not worth it to go through each one separately. I then suggested that he take them to an actual licensed appraiser, and then he could come back and we could talk more then. Or he could sort through them himself. He then said that that was the reason he brought them here, for me to do it. Again, I told him that I wasn't a licensed appraiser, and also, I didn't have the time to go through his stuff. But he begged to differ, claiming that that was my job. After some petty arguments and name-calling, I then said fine for that. I'll take the whole box for $10, or you can get out. And that's when he really started throwing the derogatory remarks, and saying that I didn't know anything because I was just some naive little girl. Channeling my inner Tony, I yelled at him to get the hell out, and to take his crappy knockoff comics with him. His idea for a response was to threaten me, and said he would come back and slit my throat while he stood over my body. Now, I can usually be pretty level-headed, but that caused me to really scream to get the F out of my store. Of course, this got the guy's attention in the back, so Tony and one of his friends came up and asked what was going on. I told them what had happened, and what his response was, but Tony was already walking up to this guy, ready to toss him out the front door by his ears, I'm sure. But the guy quickly walked out with his comics without another word. We all watched for a bit, making sure that he actually left, and then went back to our night. I know that I did a few things around the shop, watched some movie that we had there, and I helped escort some of Tony's friends out, but the rest of the night seemed to go fine. It was probably somewhere around 11 p.m., and that Tony came out and told me that I could go ahead and head home. He usually stays behind to lock up, and I'm still very thankful for that fact. As I was walking to my car, which was at the edge of the lot, it wasn't very big, so probably 5 or 6 spots from the building, I walked by a car that had just turned their headlights off. Normally, I wouldn't think much of this, but since we were closing, it caught my attention that they were turning off and not coming back on, like they were going to leave. I had stopped just past the car, and I watched as the comic guy got out of that car. I immediately was on edge and started putting my keys between my fingers, contemplating if I should run to my car or towards him to run back to the building. I chose to run towards the building, praying that I would get Tony's attention. However, I could hear him speeding up towards me as well, but as soon as I grabbed the door to open it, I felt my hair being pulled, knocking me to the ground. I yelled for Tony, and thank God, he had excellent hearing, or something, because he swung that door open so fast, smacking my ankle with it, and that guy was immediately on the ground. There were some good punches being thrown by Tony, as well as a few threats before he finally let that guy leave. I know he tried not to scare me any more than I already was, but the guy had a knife. I saw it fall to the ground, but I was in such a shock that I didn't even think about picking it up. Tony did, though. He hid it from me as he went back inside. I know that he didn't want me to call the cops because of his things in the back, so I didn't. I did tell him that if the guy came back during the day, I would consider it since he wouldn't have anything going on, and he agreed to that. He made sure that I was okay, though, and he followed me home just to make sure I was safe. I also ended up getting a nice extra bonus that week for my hard work, quote-unquote. Tony had always been like another father or uncle to me, and I never had problems with him, so I definitely didn't want to cause any problems for him. So, yeah, I may have been stupid for not calling the cops, but the fact that I never saw that guy again made me think that Tony probably got through to him. I was still pretty freaked out there for a few weeks when I had to work at night or work alone. I know that not every pawn shop is going to have someone like Tony, but a word of advice, threatening somebody over a few dumb comic books probably isn't good for your health. Oh, and to the comic book guy, you had better hope that we never meet again.